Hi there, and welcome to Power Play. I'm Vashi Kapelos in Ottawa on this Monday. Tonight, Prime Minister Carney's China challenge. The Prime Minister takes off tomorrow for a high-stakes mission to China, the first for a Canadian leader since trade talks between Justin Trudeau and Chinese President Xi collapsed in 2017. We're going to preview the economic, diplomatic, and security stakes with Amanda Lang, Guy Saint-Jacques, and Richard Fadden, who will all be here together in moments. Then, a brutal crackdown on protests by the Iranian regime.
Iran wants to negotiate. A meeting is being set up, but we may have to act because of what's happening before the meeting.
Hundreds are now reported dead and thousands detained as nationwide protests grip Iran. The regime there locking the nation under an internet blackout. Iranian-Canadian Liberal MP and Parliamentary Secretary Ali Assasi is our guest on this developing story coming up. Plus, rule change. Why is the Carney government softening Trudeau-era restrictions that block partisan slogans from publicly funded government ads? We're going to dig into that question with our front bench. Brian Gallant, Corey Tenike, Tom Mulcair, and Rob Benzie will all be here a little bit later on in the show. First, though, at this time tomorrow, Prime Minister Mark Carney will be en route to China, seeking new markets for Canadian exports and tariff relief nearly a decade after former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's trade deal ambitions did not materialize. Carney's parliamentary secretary, Cody Blois, undertook a preliminary trade mission to China back in September. Here's what he had to say Friday when asked what success would look like on this trip.
There's been a building block of success. This is the next stage of what the Prime Minister has been after since, again, back in about June of 2025. Success looks like the continuation of dialogue. We're obviously raising the trade pieces that you talked about. The fact that the trip is happening in and of itself is important.
With us now to break down the diplomatic, security, and economic stakes on this trip to China, former Canadian ambassador to China, Guy Saint-Jacques. Dick Fadden is both a former head of CSIS and national security advisor to Prime Ministers Trudeau and Harper. And CTV News chief financial correspondent Amanda Lang rounds us out this evening. Hello to all three of you. Thank you very much for making the time. Amanda, I will start with you because the premise of this trip, the impetus for it, is very much being conveyed to Canadians around the economy and trade in particular, and particularly at a time, I should say, when we are kind of suffering at the hands of the United States and collectively realizing we should not be as reliant on them. How would you qualify the opportunity, or maybe lack thereof, that China presents for Canada against that backdrop?
I mean, I would say I would go back to this question of what success looks like. I would say in its simplest form, success would be a removal of punitive tariffs on sectors of our economy. So as we all know, particularly in the ag sector, soybean, pea products, absolute removal of those would be success. The more complicated question around what success looks like is where you get to the merging of the interests that are economic, but then also national security in nature and diplomatic in nature. And that's the complexity that takes longer. Removing those tariffs shouldn't take long. That should actually be step number one, Vashi. And then you can have the conversation about what a closer, more deeply integrated trade relationship might look like.
When we hear the government in particular talk about this, Guy, they are quick to say, you know, we have these concerns around national security. We have other concerns even around China being a trading partner. But we think that there are these areas, as Amanda points out, that you know, there are mutual interests, like areas that we can cooperate on, and it doesn't have to be everything. If you were to isolate for Canadians watching, like where the opportunity in your view lies, do those areas exist, and what are they?
Well, I think that the Prime Minister has to address both security issues and trade issues during this trip. And since it's an official visit, he will have the opportunity to have good discussions with the leaders of China. And on this, it's already a more important economic relationship that our trade data show, because according to the Chinese figures, we exported close to $65 billion worth of products in 2024. According to our own figure, it was just close to 30 billion. And the difference is that the Bank of China, for instance, bought $25 billion worth of gold in 2024. So that means, from my perspective, we already export about 1/10 to China of what we export to the U.S. And China would buy all the oil, all the liquefied natural gas that we could provide. They are still very interested in our agri-food products, in our minerals. And I think in the field of clean energy in the environment, there are also good opportunities. And we have to remind ourselves that there's a growing middle class that likes a quality product. The Chinese like lobster. So if we could remove the 25% tariff on that, I think this would be most appreciated as well on pork, where Quebec pork producers would be very happy with the lifting of those tariffs.
Dick, about a decade ago, the conversation was kind of similar to this. There wasn't Trump in the way that we have come to know him as we do right now. Like, we knew him, but not in the same way, but we were talking about opportunities. In the interim, between then and now, the focus of the conversation in Canada has largely been around national security because of the events, of course, of what happened. Officials keep telling us they're going into these talks with eyes wide open when it comes to national security. What do Canadians need to know at this juncture about, the truth of that matter, in your view?
Well, I think Canadians have to know that we're not unique in this respect, that China has very active intelligence programs against most Western countries in the world. So I think that our approach to China has to be driven by pragmatism. China is there, we have to deal with them. I think, on the other hand, we have to be very, very clear that a lot of the practices that have animated your discussions and others over the course of the last decade or so are not acceptable to Canada. But they're not acceptable to any Western countries, yet we still go on. If I can just make an economic point as well, I think that it would be very good news indeed if the canola tariffs were eliminated or reduced. But China is not going to give us anything for nothing. And I think we're going to have to figure out very, very carefully what we're prepared to give. And in that context, it is impossible to ignore the United States, who have very firm views on the United States and on China, beg your pardon, and also, I think, have very firm views on how their allies deal with China. So I think Carney and company have a very, very complex job ahead of them, and security is one component. I don't think it should be determinative, but neither do I think that the economic one should be determinative. In the end, an important country like China will want more from us than just buying and selling. We have to find a way to broaden the relationship, while I think still being very, very careful about security.
It's a great point, Amanda, about the United States in particular. Even if we look at the kind of myopic issue of the tariffs, those EV tariffs were initially placed on by the previous government to be in alignment with the United States, right? And the United States still takes the position that the EV tariffs are effective and necessary. How would you characterize the economic relationship right now with China and the United States?
I mean, it's in a very interesting state because the U.S., of course, has taken a hard stance on some issues where China is concerned, but in some ways much softened from what the Biden administration was doing. And that goes to issues like the willingness to suddenly sell chips as long as the Trump administration takes a piece of the action. So there's kind of a different protocol, if you will, driving the interests of the administration right now. And it's not totally clear what sort of the thinking is other than their own interest. That does open a door, I think, to Canada to find a way to maneuver this. And what I would say, when I look at the trade data between China and Canada, what really jumps out at you is that we send them a lot of raw materials and we buy a lot more from them of finished goods. And this is a moment in our history where we're thinking hard about whether we want to be that player forever and whether we shouldn't actually think about what we can send them in the way of finished goods, how we can change the relationship in a longer term strategic way. It doesn't need to offend the U.S. Do we need to invite electric vehicles from China into Canada? Maybe, maybe not. But maybe there's some middle ground where we actually grow up a little bit beyond just being a raw material producer and think about sort of manufacturing goods and services for China.
Guy, I wanted to lean on your expertise as a long-time diplomat, because we did see something materialize today when it comes to sort of weaving through all of this diplomatically, and that is with Taiwan, right? China, of course, has a very specific position on Taiwan. Canada does not share that position officially. We had a delegation that was in China, including 2 Liberal MPs who decided to come home early because their presence there would have essentially been problematic for whatever message the Prime Minister is trying to deliver in China. The Conservatives who remain in Taiwan essentially say that's cowering to China, to an authoritarian government in China. What is your view on how that could be an example of how difficult this thing is going to be to navigate diplomatically?
Well, I think that was the right decision. It would have been difficult for the Prime Minister to explain the presence of Liberal MPs in Taipei while he was in Beijing, and I think you just have to remove as many potential problems at this stage to set the table to have more meaningful discussion. This being said, we need to continue to have contacts with Taiwan, to send a delegation there to business people, because it's a country, in fact, where it is easier to do business than in China. And I think that the Prime Minister will want to address Taiwan when he meets with the Chinese leader, will want to impress on them the importance of maintaining the status quo. Otherwise, there could be very difficult consequences for China, including sanctions.
Dick, the final word to you. As Canadians listen to this conversation and think about all the national securities that you and I have spoken about so frequently over the last number of years, and they may be asking themselves, like, is there a way to do what we just outlined and still preserve our national security, vis-a-vis China? What is do you believe the ability exists, A, and B, how do you get there?
Yeah, I think the ability exists, and if it didn't exist, we would have to create it. We are either going to develop the capacity to protect our sovereignty in collaboration with our allies, or we're going to lose that sovereignty. I think we have to be very, very clear with China what we're prepared to put up with and what we're not prepared to put up with. And I think one of the difficulties we've had with the previous administration, with Mr. Trudeau's government, is that we had a whole raft of issues and difficulties with China, and we didn't want to talk about it. I think we have to be more upfront publicly and make sure that both the Canadian population and China understands that. I hope you don't mind, but I'm going to disagree with Guy on a small point. I think it was a mistake for those 2 MPs to leave Taiwan. We have a one China policy, and whatever we can say about the Chinese, they are not stupid. They understand it perfectly well. And I think they know well that MPs and officials and members of the media visit Taiwan all the time. And we're removing them, I think, risks giving the impression that we're a little bit scared about the upcoming meeting with the Prime Minister. So while Guy is a much bigger, better diplomat than I am, I would argue in this case it would have been better for them to stay and for the Prime Minister to simply say it's consistent with the policy that we've had for the last decade.
I'm going to leave it on that note. We welcome all views on this show. Thanks for sharing yours tonight, everybody. Thanks for your analysis. I appreciate it very much. Amanda Lang, Guy Saint-Jacques, and Richard Fadden. We're going to dig into the political stakes of this trip to China with our front bench just a little bit later on. Brian Gallant, Corey Tenike, Tom Mulcair, and Rob Benzie will all be here. First, though, Iran remains locked under a near-total internet blackout, with hundreds now reported dead and more than 10,000 people detained by the regime as protests against the theocratic regime grip that nation. We're going to bring in Iranian-Canadian MP and Parliamentary Secretary Ali Assasi on the other end of a short break.
Iran wants to negotiate, yes. We may meet with them. I mean, a meeting is being set up, but we may have to act because of what's happening before the meeting.
The Iranians are fighting a fight defenseless and unarmed against an extremely brutal regime. The game changer would be for this regime to know that they cannot rely anymore on a continued campaign of repression without the world reacting to it. I didn't ask the people to come to the streets to fight against the regime because I wanted so. They asked me to step in to help them and to be their voice on the outside world.
U.S. President Donald Trump there first weighing American intervention in Iran, and exiled Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi speaking to CBS News on his support for protesters as nationwide anti-regime protests continue, despite a near-total internet blackout in Iran. The Iranian regime continues a brutal crackdown on those protests while claiming the situation is, quote, under control. But the U.S.-based human rights activist news agency, which has accurately reported on past unrest in Iran, said at least 572 people have been killed, including 503 protesters and 69 members of security forces. And the organization says more than 10,600 people have been detained over the past 2 weeks. The group relies on supporters in Iran cross-checking information. Iran's regime has not offered overall casualty figures and is claiming the unrest has been caused by U.S. and Israeli interference. With us now to talk more about this and Canada's response is Liberal MP Ali Assassi. Mr. Assassi, good to see you. Thank you very much for making the time, as always.
Thank you very much for having me, Vashi.
Does your government, Mr. Assassi, support U.S. military intervention in Iran?
I can't speak to that, but what I can say is that Prime Minister Carney, to the best of my knowledge, was the first world leader who actually did issue a statement saying what is going on in Iran is completely unacceptable.
Yes, the Prime Minister did offer condemnation in a statement, and the statement was posted alongside some other countries. Maybe you can't speak on behalf of the government's position, but this is a very live question, right? We heard the comment from President Trump. The past number of days, he has been openly speculating about the possibility of U.S. military intervention. Do you, Mr. Assassi, support that concept?
Well, I think it's important for me to say that there are differences of opinion insofar as the community itself is concerned. Right now, as things currently stand, I think the biggest concern, as you noted, is that there is a blackout in Iran. So people are having a very, very hard time. It's almost impossible for them to connect to their loved ones in Iran. So the country is cloaked in darkness. So anything that could assist in that matter and making sure that that the country is once again connected and that we have reliable information as to what's going on the ground in Iran would be very, very helpful indeed. In addition to that, I think the global community has to recognize that this cannot be business as usual. We have seen far too often brave Iranians come to the streets, but the regime only has one playbook, which is constantly intimidate and unleash their goons on peaceful protesters. So I think everyone should take note of the fact that there have to be concrete consequences for the members of the regime.
What are those consequences, though, with all due respect, Mr. Assassi? What I heard from, and I'm sure you heard as well, through the protests that were taking place in Canada over the weekend, the protests of solidarity, was thank you for a statement of condemnation, but that is not accountability. It is not the same thing, and it does not go far enough. So again, with all due respect, what is the Canadian government prepared to do to actually do more than just condemn what is going on, to actually recognize or prevent this from being business as usual?
Well, as you know, Canada did join with the EU and Australia, saying this is entirely unacceptable. Generally, when governments do so, that means they are laying the groundwork to take more concrete action as we move forward. We, in our country, do not have diplomatic ties with Iran, but if European countries and Australia and New Zealand would consider the possibility of shutting down the diplomatic outposts that the Iranian regime has all around the world, that would certainly send a very strong signal that this is not acceptable. But I do imagine, as we saw last time with the Women Life Freedom movement, that there is going to be discussions going on amongst various countries and deciding how best to respond to these latest atrocities.
To be clear, will Canada advocate for other countries to take that position in breaking off diplomatic relations? Like, is that what should happen in your view?
Well, as you know, that's the sovereign right of any country to decide for itself. But I think given the horrific turn of events that we have seen in Iran, I think that would be the expectation for a lot of people. Because, again, this is not the first time we have seen the Iranian regime do what it has done. And they have to know that there are consequences and that this is entirely unacceptable.
I want to ask specifically about the Canadian context there, because I remember you and I speaking about 3 years ago, right, when that series of protests that you talked about, these ones that are happening right now are the biggest since then, when they were occurring. And your government at the time, which you were a part of, brought in a new policy that essentially, because the accusation was that Canada was almost like a safe haven for officials associated with the Iranian regime, that they would be deported. There would be an active policy for, to root out who these people are and to get them deported. I was looking at some reporting by Global News from September, which cited statistics from the CBSA, which say that in those 3 years, only one person has actually been deported, and that the Immigration and Refugee Board, in certain instances, has blocked that from happening. The latest one in August, where someone didn't qualify, in their view, as a quote-unquote senior official. So his deportation was blocked. What message does that send to Iranians, Mr. Assassi?
Well, first of all, as you know, I think the most important thing to bear in mind is that when a country such as ours takes concrete action against a regime such as the Iranian regime, then the first most significant thing that happens is that they feel deterred from actually coming from our country. So that in and of itself is very important. But in addition to that, to the extent that I have heard, there have been numerous people who had applied to come and visit our country. They have been denied. In addition to that, I also have heard anecdotally of a few people who were asked to leave and did so. So these things are murky. I don't have all the details, but we're in a much better place than we were several years ago.
Are you sure about that, Mr. Assassi? And I ask with great respect, like you're conceding that things are murky, that the evidence you're relying on is anecdotal. The only evidence I have that isn't anecdotal shows the converse of the picture that you are painting, right? It shows that 23 suspects were identified since November 14th of 2022. 21 of those cases have been sent to the IRB for hearings, and just one person in 3 years has been deported. If the message is, as you say, that countries like ours are supposed to be sending the regime, that it's not business as usual, how is what your government has done evidence of that in any regard?
Well, first of all, as I did indicate, there were a lot of people who had applied to come here, and they were denied entry into our country. So that's the first part. The second part is the process is playing itself out. Yes, you're absolutely correct that many of these cases do go to the IRB, but we cannot interfere in the workings of the IRB. So I would certainly hope that the members of the IRB are up to speed on developments and recognize full well how important it is for our country to bar these individuals from coming here and expelling them to the extent that they may have come here.
And certainly I wouldn't intimate that the government should intervene with the board. But isn't it the job of the government to assess whether the policy it put in place to send a very clear message on foreign policy is actually effectively working? And if it's not, to amend the policy?
For sure. I think this is a good opportunity for us to look at it, make sure that it is functioning in the fashion and that it was intended to work in. And I'm sure that there will be further steps that this government will adopt.
Okay, I will leave it on that note. I'm out of time. Mr. Assassi, I appreciate your time and insights as always. Thank you very much for making the time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Liberal MP and Parliamentary Secretary Ali Assassi. On the other end of a quick break, we're going to head back to that story on China, the Prime Minister's trip to China. We'll talk about the political stakes with our front bench, Brian Gallant, Corey Tonight, Tom Mulcair, and Rob Benzie. There they are. They're back with me in just 2 minutes.
What actually we need with China is to reset the relationship a little bit. The previous government went from hot to cold on various files and didn't have the kind of robust and stable engagement that allows for the covering of a broad range of topics in strong and meaningful ways. moving forward on a trade agreement with China is a big thing, not a small thing. Canadians understand how important it is to get it right.
We are restarting broad engagement with China. I met the Prime Minister, the Premier of China, a few weeks ago. That was the first meeting between the head of the Canadian government and a senior, either the Premier or the President, in 7 years.
What a difference a decade makes, or not. Nearly 10 years ago, Justin Trudeau jetted off to China, saying it was time to reject Stephen Harper's approach to the superpower and reset relations in view of a new trade deal. Those talks disintegrated. Now, Prime Minister Mark Carney is trying again on a reset. Take two. This time, not from Harper, but from Trudeau. How can we expect it to go, and what are the political stakes? Let's bring in our front bench to talk about that. With me tonight, former New Brunswick Liberal Premier Brian Gallant. He's now the CEO of Space Canada. Corey tonight was Ontario Premier Doug Ford's campaign manager and former Director of Communications for Prime Minister Stephen Harper. He's the co-founder and CEO of Rubicon Strategy. CTV News political analyst and former NDP leader Tom Mulcair is here, as is the Toronto Star's Queen's Park Bureau Chief Rob Benzie. Hi, everybody.
Hey,
Good to see you. Benzie, I'll start with you because I thought it's so interesting that before the plane has even taken off, we have a bit of a controversy in those two Liberal MPs who were in Taiwan with this delegation alongside Conservative MPs, and they left early to come home because of the message it was sending China, essentially, that would, be contradictory in their eyes to the message that the Prime Minister is aiming to deliver when he goes. What does that tell you about how complicated this relationship is?
Well, it's hugely complicated, Vashti. And Helena Jasek and Marie-Françoise Lalonde, whom I know because they both were MPPs at Queen's Park before they were federal members, were in Taiwan as part of a multi-party delegation. And the timing would have been really, really awkward for Prime Minister Mark Carney. And we know that sensitivities with China are always high, and it is a fraught relationship. And this is there's still the hangover of the two Michaels being held for almost 2 years and 9 months as pawns in a geopolitical game. So there are so many moving parts to this that I think it's probably wise for them not to be in Taiwan at this time, even though Canada's policy is that Taiwan is Taiwan, and we don't play games on Taiwan the way that some other countries might.
Corey, there's not just like that kind of political issue. There's also the political issue that's kind of not pitted provinces against each other, but certainly there are different interests in the country. The auto sector and EV tariffs up against canola and agricultural products. What kind of potential? Is there a potential resolve to that, or is that a further example of how complicated this is?
Well, it's really complicated, and I think China's being very savvy in the way that it's picked areas to tariff to pit one region of the country against another on these things potentially. I think that's being very deliberate. And I think premiers have been very restrained in terms of their approach on this, in terms of not trying to divide the country against itself while the Prime Minister is trying to negotiate this stuff. Look, where this stuff lands, is going to be complicated. And I think the best thing for the government to do right now is probably to lower expectations pretty dramatically, because I don't think any of these things are going to be solved quickly. I don't think they're going to be solved on a first visit. I don't think they're going to be solved absent, a lot of other considerations, not just on China's side, but on our side too, as to who we want to trade with and what those relationships are going to look like going forward, especially given the position the United States is taking in a number of areas. There are things that we would probably like to do with China that the U.S. would react poorly to, and there are things that China would like us to do that would have the same reaction. So I think it's very complicated, and I don't think a lot of it's going to change quickly.
I'm not sure, and I'd love to get your perception, Tom, that there's a whole lot of expectation lowering going on. And that could probably be something we frequently say on a number of different subjects associated with the federal government right now. But even here, they're defining success. They're talking about how the tariffs are on the agenda. And even when we listen to those clips that our producers picked, it really struck me, because I remember covering that first trip in 2016, how high the expectations were set by then Prime Minister Trudeau on a quote-unquote reset. We almost need a drinking game for the word reset, in the same language as being employed 10 years later by this Prime Minister. What does that tell you?
Well, it tells me that Mark Carney doesn't want to lower expectations. He is talking the big game, and it's the justification for everything that they do. Whether it's pushing aside environmental and other rules to get projects through quickly, running roughshod, at least in the perception of the First Nations, over First Nations, rights and Inuit and Métis people's rights. So because it's all an emergency, it's the emergency doctrine. It's from 100 years ago. Give me an emergency, and then I can push anything through. I'll change the rules on government advertising because we're in an emergency. I think that the Canadian government is starting to realize the same thing Canadians have realized, that we've been extraordinarily good neighbors. We are the polite neighbor of the Americans. We've been in lockstep with them on big issues of foreign policy, of trade. Just over a year ago, just prior to Donald Trump winning his second election, we put ourselves in lockstep with the Americans for a 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles. What did that get us in return from the United States? It got us beaten up with tariffs and an intentional attack on our economy. Don't take my word for that. That's what Donald Trump said it was. He wasn't going to attack us militarily. He was going to attack us economically. Right now, Canada is working very hard, and Mark Carney has been very busy going around the world, shoring up markets, making sure the money was there for the big projects he's talking about, making sure we're getting new partners in our trade relationships, and China has to be part of that. Why, Vashi, should Canadian taxpayers be taking even more money out of their own pockets to give to the farmers who are being penalized by China because we put ourselves in lockstep with the Americans and get nothing in return? I think that that is actually on the table. I also think that there's a finite limit to our patience, and putting up with the remonstrations and the nonsense of Donald Trump over and over again, has got us nothing but grief, and it's about time we started acting on it and finding new partners with regard to what we used to talk about a lot in the past when we would visit China. Trudeau was hit with it, and prior to him, Paul Martin. Everybody who was going over was expected to talk about minority rights, Hong Kong. Not that they're not huge issues. There are people like Irwin Cotler, former justice minister, who's saying, don't forget, you've got to talk about these things. Carney is signaling clearly that he hasn't forgotten about them, but he ain't going to be talking about them publicly. He's a business partner. He's a pragmatist. He's going there to make a deal. And I think it'll be a failure if he comes back without some form of deal.
On that, they're saying, they're going to sign some officials today gave a briefing, Brian. They're going to sign some MOUs, but they're not even willing to say, for example, that a deal will be struck for sure on tariffs. In your view, politically speaking, what does the Prime Minister need to come back with in order for the trip to be characterized as a success?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, every time that there's meetings, there's premiers meetings, there's meetings with the prime minister and premiers, there's meeting with foreign leaders, there's the G7. What's going to be the outcome? I tend to think that people have seen this sort of movie before, and they recognize that it's not necessarily right then and there on the plane on the way back that they have all these sort of tidbits and tangible. This investment got done during this meeting. But I think in terms of all of the dynamics that my colleagues have talked about, Canadians are very focused on the economy. To Tom's point, I think Carney and the government kind of recognize that, and they feel that that's the priority, at least politically, if not on a substantive point of view. So I think that Tom's right to say that there's going to be a major focus on the economy, and I think for them to be able to point to success, going to what I believe a lot of Canadians are worried about at the moment, pointing to some type of movement there would probably be seen as successful. Being able to say we're going to continue the conversation on some of these thorny issues is probably, I think, acceptable. Look, they're setting the stage. The meeting itself, right, is they're trying to say is a success in the sense that it hasn't happened in 7-8 years, whatever it is. And then last but not least, I think to Corey's point, the timing. The only thing on politics that I will find very interesting in the months to come is, to Corey's point, I don't think they're going to have a free trade deal before the Kuzma review. And whether they go and they announce that a free trade agreement is in the works and they start to really sort of rev that up, is that helpful? Is it unhelpful with regards to the review with Kuzma? I actually don't know the answer to that. But certainly that has to be one of the major considerations this government has to undertake with their dealings with China moving forward.
Yeah, it would be, I think, surprising if they were able to see, Benzie, anything formal materialize. Even 10 years ago, prior to everything that's happened over the last 10 years, when Justin Trudeau was all in on a free trade agreement and saying the things you heard him say at the top of this segment, it was, things went sour well before Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor were detained.
Exactly. And I think this is the the thing that everyone has to remember and put it in context. I mean, this has been a very fraught relationship for decades. And Tiananmen Square in 1989, Brian Mulroney, the then prime minister, pulled back from China a bit because of the massacre of protesters in Beijing. So I think I understand what Carney is trying to do, and he's also doing this for reasons so that he can show Washington, say we can dance with other partners. We don't just have to dance with you. But I think Corey made a very good point about the domestic risks, Vashi. Premier Doug Ford here in Ontario is very concerned about removing those 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs. They don't want Chinese EVs being dumped, which are subsidized by the government of China. They're artificially cheap, and that's why they're dominating the market in Europe, for example, among EVs. And there's a concern about our domestic EV market, and I understand that concern. And that's the one tariff that Doug Ford welcomes. When Justin Trudeau did that to match Joe Biden, the then U.S. president's 100% tariff, Ford was cheering him on.
Okay, I got to take a quick commercial break. Yeah. Go ahead. That's okay. Go ahead.
I was just going to say there's a reason for that, and you touched on half of that, which is subsidization. The other half is theft of IP. China went to town in terms of inviting in companies like Tesla to learn how to make those EVs, ripped off the technology, and then are dumping them into our market. So it's it's the other half of the problem with China, which is the espionage and spying and IP theft.
Yeah, I think emblematic of the concern that we're turning from one problematic trading partner to the other, but perhaps, as everyone has talked about, out of necessity. Okay, I'm going to take a quick commercial break. We've got more to talk about, including some rule changes that allow the federal government to do what it used to many years ago. We've got a theme going here. We'll talk about that next. Welcome back to Power Play. There may be an unintentional throwback theme to today's front bench panels. First, it was reflecting back on a decade of China policy. Now, government advertising. After the Harper government spent $100 million public dollars promoting their economic action plan, former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau tightened government advertising rules to limit partisan content. But a new Carney government ad has been raising eyebrows for its throwback vibes. Listen to this.
It's time to build big again with Canadian workers, steel, lumber, and technology. We'll be our own best customer, sell more to the world, and take control of our future. It's time to build strong. A message from the Government of Canada.
This was all first reported by the Toronto Star, and it turns out that the $3 million ad campaign was made possible by some recent policy changes to allow for more partisan language in government ads. The Privy Council office writing to us and insisting in part Canada's government has taken responsible measures to streamline and simplify this process, as the previous policy was too slow and duplicative for the Times, which can leave Canadians with delayed access to critical information. The updated policy, the statement goes on to say, maintains robust review processes that ensure campaigns present information clearly and factually while improving review timelines. Our front bench is back. Brian Gallant, Corey Tonight, Tom Mulcair, and Rob Benzie. Corey, I was joking earlier today to the Sunday Strategy Group that this government must listen to the curse of politics and watch our strategy session on Sunday, because I don't think there's something you and Scott Reid have talked about more than how the rule change really was to the detriment of the Trudeau government. What do you think about this?
Yeah, I think if you're looking at things that killed the political career of Justin Trudeau and took that government under his leadership down to, what was it, like 17, 18%, it's the inability to communicate sometimes complicated bits of government policy to people in more simple terms. The carbon tax, consumer carbon tax, and the rebate process, they got absolutely slayed when it came to communications because the Conservative Party were able to articulate a very clear, simple message in advertising around that policy, one that I happen to agree with, by the way. I think the Conservatives were on the side of the Angels in terms of that framing of that issue. But what I would say is political malpractice on the part of the Liberal government is not doing any basic communications in terms of advertising to actually articulate that to Canadians. Like, do you think people are literally watching Question Period and reading government press releases? Is that how you expect to get information out? You're going to log on to, a Government of Canada website and read up on complicated policy? No, they're going to watch TV and listen to radio and do all the things that normal people do, read the internet. And either you make that information available to them in a way that's, easily consumable, or you're going to be defined by your opponents who do. And that notion of unilateral disarmament, to a degree that I've not seen by an elected government in the history of this country, is the path that the Trudeau government took. And if you want to see where that lands you, look at what those poll results look like at the end. It's it's certain death. And I would say if another view of how to do that, take a look at the Ford government. They're doing quite well, thank you very much, on their third term in office, and they do a heck of a lot of that sort of advertising. One works, the other doesn't. It's good for the government, I suppose, that they are catching up with the realities of life in the modern media environment.
In terms, Brian, of what's palatable to Canadians, does it matter what the ads are about? Like, if it had been explaining the rebate for the carbon tax is one thing, talking about, like, here's our strategy to build big, like in sort of very general terms, is that a different thing?
Well, first off, let me just say that when you brought up the political ad campaign, I figured that Corey would be the one amongst us that had the most to say about it. So that's good that we got that in. And look, lots of good points. So I don't know. I mean, I think the idea of having a political figure in a government ad is ridiculous. And that I come to understand is still the case, that you can't have someone do that. Having a tagline like "Build Strong," I just don't know if that's going to give you any real political advantage. I mean, I tend to think that that's just not the case. Maybe I'm wrong, but it just doesn't feel like something that is some big asset for the government to have a slogan that is similar, or pretty much the same slogan as they had in a campaign. The other thing is I would say that the idea that you can't talk about one of the most important signature pieces of your government that has turned into one of the most hot potato political conversations, as Corey pointed out, with the price on carbon pollution. Corey, the idea of
not is that
being
what it's
able
called?
Yeah. Well, back, your point is right in there at the heart of that. So I think not being able to explain that in any way or shape or form because of this legislation or the past way it was structured, I think is ridiculous as well. So I think something in the middle has to be done. And last point I'll make is, again, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't have the memory that all of you have, and Vash, you've been following this for so long, but I believe, and Tom, you would have been there, back in the day, this was brought in to kind of as a response to Harper and his sort of major investments, right, in government ads that resembled sort of messaging for the Conservatives. So probably went a little draconian on the response because it was already sort of political. So it makes sense to revise and review and make it a little more for modern times.
It was entirely a promise made by Trudeau, Tom, as you know, based on a complaint that they had leveraged as members of the opposition during that time.
Right. So let's stick with the example that we all agree on, which is the consumer-facing carbon tax came up big in Atlantic Canada with regard to heating oil. There was nothing to stop the government from talking to Canadians about that. If you look at the policy, they could have gone to the panel that they constructed and say, we're simply going to inform people, here's the law, here are the regs, there's a rebate check going out. We won't debate on what percentage of families, here's the percentage of the rebate check, and it's to cancel the carbon tax for a lot of people. That's information. What we're getting here is not information. This is flag-waving, standard-bearing for the Liberal Party of Mark Carney. And by the way, I think that Mark Carney is, for example, with his trip to China, he's been going around the world. He's been working tirelessly. I'm not taking anything away from Mark Carney, the politician, the Prime Minister of Canada. What I am saying is that Canadian taxpayers should not take the place of people who contribute to political parties. In Canada, unlike the United States, we don't allow unions, we don't allow corporations to give money to political parties. They have to raise it themselves. Then they can have ads tooting their own horn and saying who they are. When you have an ad that says, we have a new program for dental care, here are the age groups, here's the information, here's how you access it, that's just government information. When you have the flag waving, when you have the pictures, when you have the themes from the campaign, when you have the exact wording from the campaign, you're using the Canadian Treasury to buy yourself political ads that you should be paying with money that you collected. The Conservative Party of Canada sits on a big pile of cash because they're very good at respecting the rules and going after people and wringing out the very last dollar from them, and they can afford to have ads. That's why they had ads attacking Trudeau. If it's possible for Carney, because the Liberals are not very good at fundraising, they don't spend a lot of time doing it, and they're in power so often, they just say, hey, we've got the Treasury. We can access that for our own ads. There's something fundamentally wrong in our democracy. We're skewing the rules in favor of the governing party. That's why Trudeau went after it. But I will concede one point to Corey. It was self-inflicted by Trudeau. He was still so angry at Harper, he brought in a rule that wound up shooting him in the foot. But there's no reason, and I think that Brian's got this exactly right. There's no reason not to have something in the middle where you say, there are tough rules, you have to respect them, but yes, you can communicate with Canadians. Nobody's going to argue with that. These are political ads being paid with taxpayers' money by the Liberal Party of Canada, and that's wrong.
I've got just 30 seconds left. I'm sorry, Corey. I apologize. I got to give 30 seconds to Benzie because he hasn't had a comment. I'm so sorry. The segment is over after that.
All I would say, Vashi, all I would say is that the exact same, Doug Ford is doing exactly the same thing. He has watered down the rules, the political advertising rules in Ontario that were in place under Kathleen Wynne, and Kathleen Wynne's Liberals had watered down the rules that were in place under Premier Dalton McGuinty's Liberals because he overcorrected just as Justin Trudeau did so that he couldn't, when McGuinty's party was in power in Ontario, they couldn't have an ad with the color red in it. They wanted to do one with red reflectors and they wouldn't let the Auditor General said, no, that's too partisan because red is the Liberal color. So Brian and Tom are right. It's ridiculous if you overdo it, but it's also, it shouldn't, when you see Canada Strong as a government slogan, which is also the Liberal slogan, or Protect Ontario as the Progressive Conservatives government's slogan, which was also their campaign slogan, there is a real blurring of the lines between government advertising and political advertising.
I got to leave it there. I didn't anticipate such a heated debate. I will continue it at another time. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate it. Our front bench, Brian Gallant, Corey Tunick, Tom Mulcair, and Rob Benzie. Really appreciate it, guys. We're back in a moment with our takeaway. Welcome back to Power Play. Just one thing I wanted to make note of ahead of tomorrow's trip to China, eventually to China. The Prime Minister is first going to Prince Rupert, British Columbia, and intends to meet with coastal First Nations there, most of whom are opposed to the prospect of a pipeline heading to BC's northwest coast. So that will be a significant meeting to keep our eyes peeled. We do expect to hear from coastal First Nations in a press conference tomorrow. We'll share that with you as soon as it happens. I'm going to leave Power Play there. I'm Vashi Capello. Thanks for watching tonight, and have a wonderful rest of your evening.